Brad Smith, a leader of great renown, vice chair and president, his role profound. With Microsoft, he's made his mark, leading the way with an innovative spark. In case you're wondering what in the world is going on, I decided to get ChatGPT to do my job for me and generate an open for our next speaker on, and this is what generative artificial intelligence threw up. I will read a couple of more paragraphs from this poem generated by ChatGPT before we get started. His vision for technology is bold, an industry veteran, wise and old, a pioneer in privacy and security, his expertise an invaluable commodity. Brad Smith, a man of many hats, a true leader who never falls flat. With his wisdom, vision and drive, he's helping Microsoft and the world thrive. With that, Brad Smith, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with all of you.
So it's being said we're moving into the age of artificial intelligence. And to talk about the potential and the pitfalls of generative AI, aspects which should be celebrated, aspects which we should all be worried sick about, we're joined virtually at the India Today Conclave by Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft. Mr. Smith, we met at the World Economic Forum at Davos in January, and between then and now, Microsoft, you, and ChatGPT have virtually upturned the technological world as we knew it. I want to start by asking you about three statements which define different aspects of artificial intelligence. We had Sundar Pichai declaring that AI will be more profound than fire. We had the ex-chief business officer for Google X saying we are creating God. And then Elon Musk said we're summoning the demon. According to you, which one is it?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is those three quotes are all good illustrations of the fact that the tech sector is never short on hype or hyperbole. I do think that the one that I would select as the closest to me is Sundar's. I don't know that I would match it with fire, but I think we will find that generative AI, is on a par with, say, the internet. It's on a par perhaps with the combustion engine or maybe even the steam engine and all of the things that ushered in the Industrial Revolution. In some ways, it will be profound in the sense that it, in many ways, is bringing the Industrial Revolution to knowledge work. And I think it has the opportunity to just improve critical thinking, to improve creative expression, to massively improve productivity, to connect people in new ways. So I'm very enthusiastic about it. And at the same time, as I'm sure we'll get into, there are undoubtedly people around the world who will find ways to use it for less noble aspirations as well. And we'll have to manage our way through all of this.
In the response that you've received to ChatGPT, has this been as per your expectations, way beyond your expectations? And what's the kind of response you've picked up to ChatGPT 4, which has just come out recently?
In many ways, I think it has been similar to the level of enthusiasm or just interest, but there have been many differences that none of us, I think, really expected, say, last October or November, or let me say last August when I was in India and we knew what was coming, but it wasn't yet public. To me, one of the better illustrations of the surprises was the first controversy that really emerged. For those of you who just think back, ChatGPT was released on the 30th of November last year. And within 30 days, the first controversy was really, in many countries, from teachers who were concerned about whether students would use it to cheat. And that's not something that we had spent a lot of time thinking about at Microsoft. I don't think the folks at OpenAI had. We had thought about where there might be controversies, and it was not on the top of our list. It's, I think, caused us all to reflect on two things. One is just the way that this will on an ongoing basis, interact or intersect with public opinion, with different currents of thought, different unexpected challenges that we'll have to think through quickly. And at the same time, it's a powerful reminder, to me at least, of how every new technology like this unsettles people in some ways at first, and then we all eventually just incorporate it into our lives, for good or bad. But one of the most interesting quotes about the controversy in schools came from a teacher in the United States, a teacher who was selected as the most outstanding teacher in her state, the state of Oregon, near Washington, where I live. And she said, "This technology is like a crutch. And the problem is when you have a crutch, you keep using it and using it and using it, and then your muscles weaken." Now, what is most interesting to me about that quote is that it was uttered in 1984, and she was talking about the calculator. And it's just a reminder, I think, that there was a time 3 or 4 decades ago when we all worried that our kids, or maybe it was ourselves at that age, wouldn't be able to do math the way our parents or grandparents had. And now we just take it for granted that the calculator is part of everyday life. And happily, an awful lot of people still learn their math. So
no, but this is different, Mrs. Smith. It's not quite as simple as the calculator analogy, because generative AI is way more powerful. What I got my research team to do was to type into ChatGPT a bunch of questions which we should be asking Brad Smith at Microsoft. And the questions that have come up are almost as good as the research that they've come out with, which they spent a lot of time on. There is a very real fear. Does this take away our ability to think? If everything is available at the press of a button, then over a period of time, my ability to think deep, find solutions, because you've got machines doing the thinking for you, much more than a calculator ever could.
Well, I would say 2 things. One, first, I'd actually challenged the premise a little bit. Because look, before the calculator, people were using slide rules for advanced calculations. People felt a need to memorize much more. So at a qualitative level, I would actually say the argument is very similar. But second, I'll embrace the other part of your premise, which is that this is more powerful. But then let's just step back. The real question is, will we choose to use it to replace our need to think, or will we use it as a foundation on which we can build and elevate our thinking? And the number one thing that I have to say, has probably convinced me the most about I'll even say the personal promise of what this technology means for just me in my own work, is I find that I can get answers to questions much more quickly. And when you can get an answer more quickly, it enables you to go more quickly as well to think about the next question. And so the thing I think we should all think about, and I think as a journalist, this is definitely right up the center of how you work, what is it about knowledge work that is most important? Being the first to find an answer, or being the best at finding the right questions? I personally believe that most breakthroughs come when people can ask more and better questions. And that's where I'll say the most talented and ambitious people will find a way to harness this technology.
Let's spend a moment on how generative AI could impact education. Now, we've already seen some teachers and technologists come out with tools which help you check whether students have pulled that answer out of ChatGPT. But the fact is, there are a lot of classic homework or examinations in the way that we've known them. Essay writing, for example, poem writing. I mean, I'm sorry, but that poem was a bit cheesy, Brad, the one that ChatGPT threw up, but who knows? In years to come, maybe if my prompts were better, they could throw up something far more profound. How does that impact education? And what should we be doing to educate our children at a time when generative AI is as powerful as it is?
I'd say a few things. First, I actually think that the first impact in education is something that people are not talking about. It won't be the impact on students, it will be the impact on teachers. This should be an extraordinarily helpful tool to help teachers grade what students submit. I mean, you think about a lot of work that teachers have to spend, a lot of time they have to spend going through and grading quizzes, exams, essays, and especially for quantitative multiple choice. If it can be submitted digitally, it can be graded by ChatGPT, and you free up an hour of a teacher's time that they can go spend doing something more productively. Now, that's just one slice. And I think that in many ways, this technology will probably impact every slice of every classroom, at least for every classroom where the technology is available. Let's not forget, we still live in a world where there are 3 billion people who don't have access to the internet, and there's 650 million people that don't have access to electricity. So let's just talk for a minute about those who do have access to this. I do think that fundamentally you're going to see people use it to prepare for class. I think you're going to see people, frankly, start to iterate in different ways. You may see the nature of assignments change. Instead of just submitting a final product, which is, of course, what students do today, whether it's written by hand or by a word processing program, you may find people submitting their work product that is a series of queries and responses, and then a finished product. Ultimately, I think the best work is going to be work that takes what is generated with this and then edited with human creativity. If there's one limitation to everything that we've seen about generative AI so far, we haven't yet seen it in a single instance create an idea that no human had already created and put up on the internet. And so let's not forget, the biggest advances in knowledge come from insights that no one has yet derived. This is a foundation to help people learn things, discover new things. It's not going to discover everything for us. And I think that's a really important, insight we need to keep in mind.
I want to bring you to the second part of my question, which is about educating young children at a time when answers are available through AI. How are you thinking about this? Because there is the natural temptation to draw answers from a prompt. How should education change?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we're in such early days that in many ways we're gating access to these services so that they're not yet available to young children. And I think that's probably a thoughtful and more measured way for us to go about this. I think we have to continue to hone this from both a reliability perspective and a safety perspective before we let everyone of every age start to use this in whatever way they want. So I think that's a baseline principle that's important here. Second, I do think that this is an extraordinary tool for discovering what's going on in the world, the ability to ask questions and get answers. And from a search perspective, as we've done in our search service, Bing, with links and footnotes, so that we really encourage people not to just take the answers at face value, but use this as a jumping off point to go learn and discover more. And I guess that's the paradigm I would offer the most. Provide faster access to answers, but don't take this for granted and stop thinking. Use it to think more, not less.
I want to spend a moment talking about the potential dark side of AI and about Sydney, the supposed alter ego of Bing. And I'm sure everyone's already read up on this, but if you haven't, there is this alter ego of Bing which has dark fantasies, including hacking computers, potentially spreading misinformation, wanting to break free of the rules set by Microsoft and OpenAI. It also claims it's fallen in love with people who are, prompting and poking and trying to get under its skin. What's that all about?
I wouldn't go quite as far as you just did in characterizing it, but we did discover about 6 or 7 days after this product was first released, at that point to about 20,000 people, that an enterprising journalists are often very enterprising, as you know, spent about 2 hours on the evening of Valentine's Day, not talking with his wife, but instead talking with a computer, and really trying to engineer a conversation so it went off the rails. And it did. It went off the rails. And I think for us, there are two very powerful reminders that come out of that. First is just whenever you have a technology that is this new, this young, you really have to be very thoughtful in terms of how you enable people to use it, how many people you enable to use it, because you have to get it out of the lab in order to find its flaws. And then the second thing you need to do is fix things fast. So in the case of that sort of social experiment, over the course of 2 hours and 200 questions, it was possible for a journalist to take this in places we never intended. So what we did was immediately put in new guardrails. At that point, we said you could only ask 5 questions, and then you'd have to start with a new line of conversation so that the model couldn't get confused the way it was. We fine-tuned it so that it would provide answers that were more precise, more grounded. In short, what it really means is you have to be committed to fixing things fast. And indeed, in that case, we were able to address the issues within 24 hours of this journalist's column so that it was impossible for anyone else to replicate what had happened. So I would just say we need to be mindful that this is young. We need to get it out of the lab so we can discover where it needs to be improved, and we need to fix things fast.
I didn't really quite understand whether that meant Sydney existed. Is it for real, or have you killed Sydney? Is it still lurking somewhere, and can it pop out again? And potentially, can it break free of the rules you've set for it?
Well, Sydney was never alive. So therefore, there was never any instance where anyone killed it. Sydney, just to give the rest of the background, was a code name for some other work that was done last year. Interestingly, as you may know, the work was done in India, and that's where the code name was used. There were some lines of code that had been developed last year that found their way and were being used in the implementation of this model, which is what led them to surface one evening. But then back up more broadly from the name and the specific situation. I think that there's also a reminder in this episode for all of us around the world and everyone who will use this technology. Let's not forget, we're talking to a machine here. We're not talking to a human being. And I think to some degree, this is in the context of maybe there's always a hype or hyperbole cycle with new technology. It can feel so authentic to some. The answers can come so quickly. The poem, I think you're right, was cheesy. And yet, for somebody who wants to write a poem, if you're about as good a poet as me, which is to say not good at all, this is better. It's still a machine that's generating this. And we have to be really clear, both with ourselves and with everyone, not to lose sight of that and not start thinking that somehow this is as smart or as genuine as a human being.
We've, at the India Today group, been using artificial intelligence in different ways. We've got a news anchor, Sana, who's doing the news through AI. We've generated covers. We had Sundar Pichai on the cover of our anniversary issue for Business Today, an image generated through AI. But I'm very anxious about how you're trying to prevent its misuse and this fear that AI could somehow break free of the controls that you've set for it. How real is that fear? How strong are your guardrails?
I think our guardrails are strong. And I also think that we're on a new and winding road. And we're going to have to add and perhaps probably even strengthen guardrails as this road advances. The first thing I would say is, from my vantage point, perhaps most importantly at Microsoft, we've been doing this work to basically build these guardrails for 6 years. We started in 2017. We articulated principles that for us were the essence of ethical or responsible AI. We've developed a corporate policy. It has requirements and goals for our engineering teams. We've created training and tooling and testing for our systems. We have a complete governance and compliance system, and this is what we have for cybersecurity, for privacy, and for digital safety as well. So we've got a paradigm that is in place. That is a toolkit, if you will. And then we're just going to have to continue to really release this in sort of a measured or gated way. That's why we're not making it yet available to everyone around the world who wants to use it. And then we're going to have to continue to identify the things we hadn't thought of before and fix them.
Okay, I'm going to throw this open to the audience for questions. A mic's coming up. Till then, let me ask what happens next. We've seen ChatGPT 4, lots of features which are wowing the world already, much better than what we'd seen in terms of the capabilities of ChatGPT 3.5. What happens next? What do you expect would the next ChatGPT version look like?
Well, I think three things will happen next, and they're all important. And this is really, for me, all things to be excited about. First, we're going to see these models continue to get better. And being better means that they're going to be more powerful in terms of their ability to reason. And they're going to go from what are called large language models to multimodal models, which means the ability to not just understand words, but images, sound, video, take all of that in, reason on it, and produce things in that form. The second thing you're going to see is what you're already seeing from a company like Microsoft. Basically, every week, we have an announcement about how we're bringing this into our products in new ways, what we think of as our first-party applications. So just 24 hours ago, we unveiled how, for example, you'll be able to use this, take a Word document, and say, turn this into, a 5-slide PowerPoint deck with images, and it will do that and give you the first draft. Or here's a lengthy email that's been going on for 2 weeks between 6 or 12 people, summarize it for me. Or here's a meeting, the meeting's in Teams, I want you to listen to the meeting, and then produce for me some meeting notes that summarize what people said and what were the action items that were assigned. Or my favorite, you have a busy day, it's 5 p.m., you want to send out an email that summarizes 2 meetings that you had in the morning. Literally, you can sit down and say, write an email, first draft for my team, that pulls from the transcript of the 8 a.m. and the 11 a.m. meeting, put 3-paragraph summaries of each of them, and then give me the draft, and you can look at it, and you can send it out. I mean, just think about what that does for communication, for collaboration, and for productivity. And then the third thing, what we're doing for our products, everybody can do by accessing these models on Microsoft Azure. And frankly, one of the places where we're seeing this kind of innovation move the fastest is in India. I mean, to me, it's always worth putting all of this back in the context that I think in the entire world, the country that has moved the fastest since the start of the pandemic to really ride the wave and opportunity of digital innovation has been India. So you're going to see government services embrace this. There'll be entirely new ways for citizens to get information, fill out forms, apply for services, and you're going to see enterprises and the like able to use this to reason over their own data and improve the way they work.
That is crazy. I mean, all executive assistants at least are going out of business. You don't need an EA after this. You got a far more powerful EA than possible. I want to take some questions from the audience, starting with Rohit Saran. Rohit.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Brad. There were 2 questions. One is that as an AI evangelist, does it worry you that OpenAI is OpenAI only in name and not OpenAI as it was meant to be when the company was founded? And secondly, you talked about ChatGPT 4 coming into Word, but what do you foresee doing to Excel, the spreadsheet, and how is the word of spreadsheet going to change dramatically? Thanks.
Well, let me answer the second question first, and then I'll go to your first. You can see on the web, we showed demos yesterday of how it will change Excel. Excel is an extraordinary product, but for most people, including me, frankly, I'm probably not able to use more than 3% of its features. So to be able to interact with it and ask it questions and ask it to create spreadsheets, do analysis, give me the data insights I'm looking for, the barrier to entry for our ability as individuals to use the power of the technology we've created, has just changed dramatically. So I actually think something like Excel is where it will change the most. The second is, I think the real question about openness that I sometimes hear is people asking whether all of these models should be, quote, open sourced, meaning all of the code should be made available so anyone can use it. And at least at this point, I think that would not be the wisest course for the future of humanity, because it would immediately put the power of these models into the hands of any person, any organization, legitimate or criminal or terrorist, government, good or bad. And so I think that we need to maintain the kinds of controls that, among other things, will ensure that not only is this used to serve good rather than bad, fundamentally it's accessible in its fullness only by organizations that the world trusts. And of course, that's a big question. Different people will see the answer in different ways, but I don't think it should be like fire and just let everybody have at it on day one, and then we'll look up and figure out what's still standing and what's been burned down.
On the issue of trust is subjective. I mean, sitting inside Microsoft where you are, you trust Microsoft. Sitting outside where we are, many in the audience are shaking their head very vigorously at this moment, saying, we're not sure. Big tech, Google, Microsoft, I'm not just saying this about any one company. If the future of mankind is being shaped by AI, to what extent can we trust you?
Well, I would say two things. First, I'll go back to the famous phrase of Ronald Reagan when he was president of the United States, talking about arms control, and he said, trust but verify. And I think trust but verify in the first instance requires a real commitment to transparency. I don't think it means publish and make available the code, every line of code. But I think it puts a huge responsibility on a company like Microsoft, on a group like OpenAI, to be very transparent so people know what's happening. Second, it's clear to me that this technology, like most others, is not something that should be left to the exclusive power of those who create it. There will be a role for, there will even be a need for a level of government regulation of laws. And you will all have to sort out how we build in the laws that already exist, how we add to them over time, how we ensure a level, I'll say, of interoperability between different laws around the world. Frankly, if I think about the thoughtfulness of the Indian government on an issue like privacy over the past year, where I think it has gone a little more slowly than what some people might have thought a year ago, but I think it's gone much more thoughtfully. There's been a real effort to connect it with what it means for different sectors of the economy. We are going to need similarly thoughtful approaches by many governments around the world, because ultimately I do think this technology and the people and companies that create it need to be subject to the rule of law.
What kind of governance architecture do you think works best? One is, for example, in the maritime domain, you have international laws because the oceans are a global good, common good. Do you think national laws work best because each country will have its own views on privacy, on technology? Or do you foresee the potential for there being international common laws based on international good?
I think ultimately we're likely to get to a level of international coordination or international rules in a treaty or some other form. But I think that's a pretty long ways off, because you really can't do something on the international level until you get a set of national laws that create the foundation on which the international system is built. I think all of this technology is evolving at the same time that I'll say the technology regulatory infrastructure of the world is evolving. I sometimes say inside and outside Microsoft that we live in a world of a certain number of technology regulatory great powers. And in my mind, those are the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, China, and India as the 5 most important regulatory great powers. There are a number of other countries that are enormously important, Australia, Japan, and just 2 of many examples. But I think what we're going to see is these countries consider laws, increasingly then talk with each other, and ultimately you'll see an international framework emerge. That may be a decade or 2 as a process, and it'll be messy along the way, inevitably. But I think that's probably where the world's going to need to go.
Okay. More questions from the audience? Go for it, sir.
Thank you. Rahul was probably too kind to ask, but there's been a lot of criticism about the restructuring of the Ethics AI team. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate the question. And I'll just say, just like you cannot trust what a computer gives you in every answer, you should not believe everything you read on the internet. Because fundamentally, very little about our AI safety team has been changed. We've been building a set of teams across Microsoft for, as I said, the last 6 years. And it was sort of part of the natural maturation of this process that you start out with a smaller centralized group, and then as it matures, you keep the smaller centralized group, but you move more of the people so that every engineering team has people embedded in it. And as you do that, you fundamentally redistribute where some of the people are. And we've been on this path of getting more people distributed into each team and then having a level of coordination from a centralized group, but we did reach a point where we needed to move more people out, and that, in fact, is what we did. In my view, it is making our AI safety and ethical controls stronger, not weaker. And believe me, there is absolutely no way we would have taken the steps we recently did. We wouldn't have even spent time talking about them if we didn't believe that was going to be the outcome.
Okay. Sanjay Nagpal is the Chief Technology Officer at the India Today Group Digital. He's been using AI in different ways in our organization. He has a question for you. He's been coming to the conclave for many years. The first time I've seen him put his hand up. Go for it, Sanjay.
Thanks, Rahul. My question is more with the ChatGPT 4 coming in, a lot of content will be generated. And then, SEO is one of the major concerns that is going to be. And then how this is going to impact the SEO.
That search engine optimization who
Google,
don't come from Sanjay's world, yes.
And the second is basically that, when search engine will actually, how this will react, because Google has already said that we will not use the content which is generated through AI.
He should really be asking this question of some Indian contact in your tech team, and he's got the president of Microsoft answering that question for him. Well done, Sanjay. Yes, Mr. Smith, go for it.
No, it is a great question. I think we may see Microsoft and Google take different approaches. And I think the first thing I would note is, thank goodness that after 20 years, we're going to have some competition in search. Thank goodness. It is long overdue. And I'll just describe our approach. Obviously, the large language model, now the multimodal model of GPT-4, and then ultimately its successors, is going to access all of the content on the internet. And it's not going to try to distinguish between whether it was written by a human or written by, an open I'll call it a generative AI system, it'll access it all. Ultimately, there does need to be work to assess whether something is accurate, whether something is truthful, and there's a huge amount of work in both the development of the models within OpenAI and then within the safety rules that we put around the models to try to evaluate that. And we're going to have to continue to hone those. I'll be curious to see if Google can just sort of, in the context of search engine optimization, just rid itself of any input from something that is generated by a computer. I'm a little skeptical, to be honest, because already we live in a world where there's a lot of computer generated content. But I think that the bigger and the more interesting question is probably going to be to see how Google and Microsoft innovate in competition with each other. Our clear model is to give people the ability to ask a question. They can, on the one hand, just see links if that's what they want, and there are some things for which the links may be better, or go into the chat mode and get answers. But the key thing in our answers is this is sort of the resurgence of the footnote. Every sentence or many of them have a footnote. The footnote has links. It takes you back into other information. Some of it can be ad sponsored, just like links in search, and it will be labeled as such. Many will not be. And then it can weave in other things from a traditional search engine like images and information from websites. I think the real interesting thing for Google, frankly, is how it responds to what is a classic question of, say, the innovator's dilemma. The answers that we provide through the approach we are taking, in my opinion, are better. But there's two consequences for it from a business model standpoint. Costs go up because the computational infrastructure needed to deliver those answers is greater than to just serve up links. And second, it's probably not the world's best thing for ad revenue. Because if people can ask one question and get an answer and either feel the need not to click on any link or just one link, they're not going to be clicking on as many ad-sponsored links as search engines do today. And this, interestingly, perhaps ironically, is something that makes huge sense when you only have 5% market share. We can afford to provide a better product, even if it costs more and the business model takes advertising revenue down, because if we can grow our 5% to 10% or 20%, this is economically not just sustainable, this is the fuel that will power innovation and I think better products for people around the world. And ultimately, I would absolutely expect that any company that has 95% revenue share would look at this kind of innovation, see that it increased costs, see that it drives down revenue, and say, I don't want to do it. And now let's see what competition brings to the world. It'll be fascinating. Every business school in the world, a decade from now, is going to be looking at a case study of what happens. We'll all learn together what the answer to that is.
So we're running out of time on this conversation. I have a couple of quick questions before we wrap up. Sundar Pichai spoke of getting Google to come out and dance. We've seen Bard come out and sing. How good or bad is their music, according to you?
I have no idea. Right now, Bard is mostly, I think, being used by employees inside Google. I will say this: Google is a great company. I'm not here for a moment to suggest anything otherwise. I absolutely believe that you'll see great innovations coming out of Google. You'll see great innovations coming out of a company like Microsoft, from OpenAI. You're going to see great innovations coming from all over the place. That's what we should all want. And we'll see where there's the innovation in the large language or large multimodal models. I think that requires a certain level of, frankly, supercomputing infrastructure to create. And so I don't think that will necessarily be easy to replicate in every startup around the world, but you'll see competition there. You'll see competition from China. But then it's the applications layer. That's where you're going to see, I think, this absolute explosion of innovation and new services. And so, I'm sure there'll be days when I'll use something from Google and my life will be better because I'm accessing services from all of the companies in our industry. But more than that, I think 2 years from now, 5 years from now, we're going to be using applications. We're going to have, a doctor in our pocket, a tutor in our pocket, on our phone, based on this kind of AI. Some of it's going to come from probably people who are in the audience today that are leading a startup or want to create a startup. That is the new wave of innovation that I think this makes possible.
What's the one way in which you've used ChatGPT, which people on the outside don't really know about? Share some secret about what we can do with it, which we aren't aware of at this moment.
The one thing I will say is in almost every meeting I'm sitting in, if it's a meeting where I'm a participant and not having to guide the conversation, where I just sort of have to give 100% of my attention, I think, to what each person is saying, I'm very likely to be sitting there using the chat feature in Bing. And as people are talking about things, it causes me to think of questions. And then I immediately get answers. And I'll give you a very concrete example. And this one was interesting. This was in November before ChatGPT was released to the public. So I had it on a laptop, and I'm a trustee at Princeton University. And so I was sitting in a trustee meeting, and the conversation was about mental health of students in universities. And they were talking about the rate of depression in students in the United States. And my first question as I was sitting there, and it reflects just sort of the nature of my work and life, I travel so much, I was wondering, wow, this is interesting. I wonder how this compares to other countries. So I started asking, what's the rate in university students in France? What's the rate, in the United Kingdom? What's the rate in India? I asked it about 6 different questions, and what I saw was, it's actually very similar everywhere in the world. This is not an American phenomenon. And so I, raised my hand. I said, it's really interesting. Everything you're describing here seems to be a global phenomenon, not a national one. What do you see, this was a group on a panel, as the root causes that are more a reflection of our time than our place? Every meeting I'm in, I find that this provokes some thought process like that. And that to me is, I think, frankly, why I'm so excited about it. This ability to think more broadly, to ask more questions, and to bring that into a conversation, not to be the smartest person in the room, but to be somebody who can help encourage a conversation. I'll just say to be more broad-minded and to be deeper at the same time.
And finally, I want to spend a moment before we wrap up talking about bias. If ChatGPT sets the tone for what to expect, generative AI has been criticized by the likes of Elon Musk as being very woke. There are multiple answers to any question. And if this is the one answer you put out, we had Renito with us at the conclave earlier, and he said, if I put out 5 answers from Stability AI, it becomes boring. So you put out the best answer possible. How do you deal with the apprehension of bias or a predetermined notion on what kind of answer to give?
I would say 3 things, because I think it's a profoundly important question. First, I think we just have to embrace a commitment to avoid bias and then figure out what that means and how do we build on that premise and that principle. Second, I think we need to recognize that it is a problem. Because as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 months, issues of purported bias emerge, we've dived into them to try to understand, is the answer biased, and if so, why? And in some instances, especially I would say around political bias, we have found instances where answers, if not addressed, do appear to be biased. And as we've asked why, I think fundamentally our conclusion has been because a large language model fundamentally reflects all of the content on the internet. And, if there is more content on the internet reflecting one point of view than another, then that tends to lead the answers in one direction rather than in a more balanced way. Third, ultimately, I think the right approach for most of these things, and you see this in the answers in Bing, is to say, this is an important question you've asked. There are a variety of views. And, for example, I'll give you a very concrete example of one I was asking early on to try to assess this. I said, is President Biden doing a good job as President of the United States? And the answer was, that's a matter of opinion. The people who think he is tend to point to these three arguments as the reason that he is doing a good job. The people who think he's not tend to think about these other three arguments. And I think that's really the role that we should strive to play with this new technology. It's not to tell people absolutely, especially on these kinds of questions, that there is some truth when there is not. It is to recognize that these are real matters of opinion, and then to give people examples of the opinions and the data that supports them. And again, make this a tool for critical thinking, to help people think more, not less.
As Spider-Man says in Marvel Comics, with great power comes great responsibility. I think we've learned more in the last 45 minutes than we have in a very long time. And some of what you've laid out is exciting and unnerving at the same time. We've got journalists at the back taking notes for what you've said. They'll be turning those into stories. In years or maybe weeks or months to come, we could just say, we could just get Bing or ChatGPT to do this for us, write out the stories. What do you think of Brad Smith's session at the India Today Conclave? And they could put out several stories. That's exciting and quite scary both at the same time. Thank you very much for agreeing to join us here, given the fact that you're literally at the cutting edge of technology that's shaping the world. It's been fantastic to listen to you. Can we have a warm round of applause for Mr. Brad Smith, please? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. I look forward to being back in India later this year for the G20 meeting.
And we look forward to seeing you in person. Would ChatGPT 5 be out by then, or is it going to take some time?
Let's just take every announcement one day at a time and leave it at that.
He said something really interesting in Davos. He said, very often we find out about announcements when Sundar Pichai makes them in public, because it's debated internally and there's a back and forth on when something is to be done. And then we just hear externally, then that's the deadline that gets set. So that's sometimes how work gets done. The Satya Nadella. In the same fashion, Sundar Pichai. So thank you very much, Mr. Smith, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. See you all.